Good evening, everyone. I am so happy that y'all took the time to be a part of this event, which is being co-sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Greenville County and also the Greenville Branch NAACP. And it is my absolute honor to be affiliated with both of these wonderful organizations and to be representing them here tonight. I wanted to take a moment to thank in particular Laura Haight, who is doing the magic behind the scenes, making all of this work. I want to thank all of my fellow League members, all of my fellow NAACP members, all guests who are here, and especially, and of course, Dr. Holly Pinheiro, our featured guest. I do want to mention for those of y'all who are not already NAACP members or League of Women Voters members that you perhaps take the opportunity to check us out. I think it's fair to say that the missions of these two organizations, which like the work we're going to be talking about today, is both a part of history and very relevant to the present moment. I think their missions have never been more crucial or more important. We are going to drop links to the websites for both the NAACP and the League of Women Voters here in Greenville, so y'all can get to know us better, which we would welcome. I want to make a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. Holly Pinheiro and I decided to structure this as a conversation. We want it to be casual and informative, and we very much welcome your participation in that. Also, to keep things flowing, we'd like for you to please keep yourself muted. And if you have questions, and we very much hope that you do, we ask that you put those questions in the chat, and the chat will be monitored, and we will be doing our very best to weave those questions into the conversation as we go. In terms of timing, we're going to, again, follow the flow of the conversation. If it's still going at 6:50, at 10 till 7, we'll wind things up then and leave some space for a few final questions if people have them. But I promise to get you out of here by 7 o'clock. And again, I thank you so much for being here. It is deeply my pleasure to introduce our featured guest, who is Dr. Holly A. Pinheiro, Jr. He is an assistant professor of African American history at the Department of History at Furman University. He has published articles in edited volumes and academic journals, both in and outside of the United States, and has been interviewed by the History Channel, Curiosity Streams, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. We are fortunate to have Dr. Pinheiro with us today to talk about his recently published book, The Family's Civil War, Black Soldiers and the Fight for Racial Justice. This book follows almost 200 African American men who served as Union soldiers in the Civil War, as well as around 800 of their family members over a period that spans from the 1850s to the 1930s. This work highlights how racism in and outside of military service impacted the bodies, economies, family structures, and social spaces of African Americans, even long after the war ended. Holly, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you all so much. Words cannot express my sincere gratitude for this opportunity, to everyone that made this possible, for the audience members here, for your time, and I've been looking forward to this since the opportunity was given, so thank you.
Thank you. One thing I also want to mention is that for those who are here, I'm very happy to tell you that as an attendee, you have the opportunity to purchase this wonderful book. I have and love my copy, even got it signed by the author. And you can get it at a 30% discount from the publisher's website. So we are going to be dropping a link to the publisher's website and to the discount code that you can use. And I encourage everybody to make good use of that. To get us started, Holly, when I read this wonderful work of yours, I know that you focus on freeborn African-American men from Philadelphia who fought in the Civil War. And as I was reading, I was curious, why Philadelphia? How was Philadelphia special, or what led that to be the focus for you?
So also just about the, for those who hopefully are interested in purchasing the book, I tell this to everyone, Do not buy the hardback, buy the paperback. I'm telling you as the author. And if you're hoping to, and I hope you do use the code, that's only going to be through the press's website for UGA Press, not Amazon or wherever else you might go for it. So why Philly? The honest answer, I have family there. And I'm just being truthful. So this was an extension of my dissertation because I was really fascinated and interested in what is life like for freeborn Black people. And so I had family for my dissertation that were in New York City and Philly, and staying at my grandma's and uncle's house while I'm doing the research was more financially conducive for me as a graduate student and a budding scholar. I also want to acknowledge, so on my mother's side, we were able to trace our family tree back to slavery in South Carolina and Florida. And I never want to make the statement that we should stop looking at the freed experiences. They are very important and should always continue to be discussed and honored. But I was always curious about what is life like for Black people living in a place like New York and Pennsylvania, where slavery is outlawed and the state constitutions by long before the war has begun. And how are these individuals navigating in places like Philadelphia, where systemic racism was very normal, where these individuals, unfortunately, every Black person that came through Philadelphia throughout the 19th century was unfortunately a victim of discrimination that did not care about gender or age. And for me, it was really trying to contextualize that in understanding these family stories and arguing that the Civil War is not the defining moment in these people's lives, nor is Reconstruction. It's that their definitions to me is like their persistence and love for each other in the face of this unfortunately unending forms of discrimination. And it's their perseverance that truly brings me so much joy. And I'll just throw this out there because I couldn't believe this happened this morning. I actually had the privilege of talking with one of the descendants of the people in this book. And she cried. So then I started crying because I'm a crier. And she was saying, thank you for telling my family's story and telling us that we matter. And that got me because it's like, I've been studying these people for 15 years. And I always question, does anyone care about their histories? And the fact that you're here right now, that means the world to me. And I promise you, it means the world to this relative and others, because this is a big issue. And I'm saying we as academics and society have overlooked how freeborn Black people experience life because we are so hyper-focused on the freed story. And I understand why, but we need to recognize Black families who are free and navigating places like Philadelphia, which has a rich history of women's rights activism with Lucretia Mott, for example, but also abolitionist networks that are basically the who's who. So to me, understanding those dynamics are important to understanding the Civil War and these families.
Absolutely. Your point about, talking to a descendant and, sort of the personal element here. I know something that really struck me. I told Holly after I read the book that he reminded me of what I love about history, because you're starting from these, what are the sources you use? It's like the census and military enlistment records and these sort of intrinsically dry documents, but how clear you make it, the humanity, right? That these are people's stories illuminated by these primary documents.
Yeah, the records that I used, so the book looks at the 3rd, the 6th, and the 8th United States Colored Infantry, or USCI. And for context, they are actually connected to South Carolinian history. They are connected to Juneteenth. They're actually connected to the ending of the Civil War. And just because a lot of people may not know this, Black soldiers are the ones who will chase Robert E. Lee's forces to Appomattox, and they are at the surrender, including some of the soldiers in this book. They're in Texas emancipating people who are already freed, but they were being denied the rights to their humanity and their lives. And so that's part of the story. But the other part is through the records, the family experiences. Because, and I say this as someone who was raised, my mother served for 20 plus years in the United States military. And for me, I always was very angry at the idea when someone would look only to her and say, thank you for your service, and never acknowledge my grandmother, my aunts and uncles, my relative, like everyone, including our community, that were hoping and praying for her safety, trying to support her as she came home and dealt with issues of unemployment. And so for me, it was trying to make experiences that I and other, sadly, military families still experience today. Why have we not taken that same approach to people who are pivotal in winning the Civil War, in fundamentally changing our country, and not just the men in uniform? They're the wives, the grandmothers, the grandsons, the great grandchildren, but also the soldiers as people, right? Like, who were they before the war? Did they go to school? Did they get married? What happened after, the service? What was their home life like? And I found all of that through the pension records, which are at the National Archives. They're absolutely amazing. I can happily share some PDFs so y'all can see what these records look like. They are surreal. You never know what you're going to find. It's literally a crapshoot. One record might be 3 pages. One might be 800 pages. Then I get the pleasure of having to unpack each of these, but contextualizing it with the federal census, which, as Lawson points out, is a very dry document. But the thing about the census is that's how I was able to find the important contributions that the women were playing, that there were successful Black women as businesswomen during a period of time when they weren't supposed to be doing that, and they owned real estate and were successful and did not need a man to do it. So in many ways, these families are running counter to what society says is a woman's place, and that this was normal for Black families because they're trying to survive and support each other and be successful, even in the constant brunt of discrimination. The other records are Black and white newspapers, some which still exist. So I use the New York Times, the Christian Recorder, which is connected to the AME Church in Philadelphia, the Weekly Anglo-African, and also published records by the soldiers themselves. Because for me, and I'll just close with this, what made the stories personal was difficult. Because when I pitched this as a grad student, I told my professor, look, I want to talk about Black soldiers who are saying things about the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. They're talking about Jim Crow, right? Like these big moments. And what I found in the pension records is none of that. I have one soldier who talks about Appomattox, and all he says is, yeah, I was there, which to me was like, oh, bro, like, give me more. But what I did find was talking about issues of unemployment before and after the war, frustrations with during the war not being given their money that they're owed. So some of the Black soldiers don't get paid for 9 months. And so if you've ever seen the film Glory with Denzel, Matthew Broderick, Morgan Freeman, like for me, it's taking that film and making it more personal to include their families. But then also when these soldiers, if they survive, come home with various disabilities, including what we know as PTSD. There is unfortunately instances of domestic violence that is very horrific. There is an invasion of privacy by the United States federal government and the military into the private lives of these families. And from my conversations, even with the gentleman who was doing some work on my HVAC unit who served in the military, he was like, when you're talking about these Black families from that period of time, I still am the one struggling with the bureaucracy and the invasion of what my life is in terms of what the federal government and particularly the United States military expects of us. So it's like the relevancy of these people's lives and hardships, but also their persistence is still important today. And my hope of all hopes is that people walk away knowing that families are important to understanding American history, not just men, their entire communities. And without understanding the families, we're not really understanding truth history because the soldiers are writing to their families back home. I miss you. Here's the money, right? And the letters are going the other way. And for me, it's for whatever reason, academics have ignored Black families. And I'll just close with this. People of the time knew how important these people. Congressman William D. Kelly of Pennsylvania will say during a presentation where Anna Dickinson and Frederick Douglass are in Philadelphia that the most important people to the United States war effort by 1863 are Black women. Black soldiers throughout the war will say that the most important recruiters and supporters are Black women because they become the nurses. They become the ones who raise the money for the military flags. they're the ones doing arguably everything because they witnessed that the military isn't providing clean water, uniforms, really the basic necessities to train for war. So once we understand the fight that these families are engaged in, we understand the actual historical moments better.
Absolutely. And I mean, one thing that struck me was how your book opens, like the first kind of scene is a woman, the partner, the female partner of a soldier who, I mean, didn't she was pregnant when he joined the war effort. And, and it's her trying to pursue a pension, a claim for that child unborn when his father went off to war. And the way that illuminates those really hard choices that people were making, right? Where there's this drumbeat of like, hey men, you owe this to fill in the blank, your community, your enslaved brethren and sestrin, that you owe this, but then the choice is also to leave your family behind. And yeah,
I mean, the Mary Leighton is the individual that Lawson is referring to. Her testimony, which opens up the book, I, to be honest, freaked out when I saw it. Her statement ran counter to a lot of conversations that people have when they talk about the legacy of the war, particularly talking about particularly United States soldiers and service members as heroes, and that all the patriotic, the rah-rah. But her statement to a pension agent who were always white men was that the war stole my husband, destroyed my family. And I traced the Davises and throughout the book, and they are in many ways connected to glory. I won't spoil it, but Benjamin tries to join the 54th Massachusetts, and his decision starts this cascading of horrific events for his family. And it's difficult. But for me, it was also empowering to see the ways in which Black women and the Black communities continue to fight to be remembered, and also that they will be heard. Because as a grad student, one thing that I remember in class was someone saying, we can't find the voices of Black women in the 19th century. They're very difficult to find. I would argue that my book and a number of other scholars would refute that without not even batting an eyelash. They're there. These records have always been there. I don't make any money saying this, but through ancestry.com, a lot of these records are online and digitized right now. So anyone saying we can't find women's voices, you're not looking or listening, and you are doing a disservice.
Absolutely. One of the points that you made that really, really hit me, and I, couldn't agree with more, where you said that people act like African American history is obscure, right? Like you actually can't find it. Like it's, oh, we'd love to focus on that more. Doggone it, we just can't. It's obscure. When in fact, what's more the truth is people are ignoring available information.
Right. Well, that actually connects back to the conversation I had with the relative this morning. Oral histories are legitimate history and historical records. And there are some people who don't agree with that. They are. Because there is a long history of that not just Black people use, Indigenous people have used to keep their stories alive, especially when it runs counter to the larger historical popular narrative. So the thing for me is that there was a commitment of the soldiers to have their stories remembered. The first Black historians to talk about the Civil War were Civil War veterans and the women connected to them and some of their white allies. And they do it, and they'll say as early as 1867, well into the 1890s and early 1900s, nobody is going to remember us, so we must do it ourselves. And it's not until the modern civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s and forward that white scholars all of a sudden go, wow, we didn't know that this material was here. But first and foremost, just to be clear, Carter G. Woodson was being told about Black soldiers' history, one of the creators for Black History Month. W.E.B. Du Bois is the son of a veteran. Susie King Taylor was a Black woman who served in a South Carolinian regiment as a nurse, formerly enslaved, marries a Black veteran. They're telling their stories, and the community has always known it. So for me, it's I think my work is more about reclaiming what everyone in the community knew, and that I'm using federal government documents to confirm oral histories that have been passed around for a long time.
Absolutely. I mean, it's, just thinking about, obviously it's in a different arena somewhat, but it's the same point about the fact that everybody at the time knew, or lots of people knew, that Thomas Jefferson had children with Sally Hemings, right? And then it's obscure, for the better part of a century. But no, people knew.
I mean, the thing that I love about the records is, like, to me, these federal government documents actually refute the lost cause, which systematically sought to erase the Blacks' participation and experiences other than as victims from these historical moments. And pensions are very problematic. They are very invasive into people's lives. They are very racist, discriminatory in terms of how they treat women and view women's contributions to their communities and families. At the same time, these are federal government records that document Black participation in the Civil War and its legacy. And I spoil the end of my book, which I hope you read. One of them is in the pension. I had no idea that I would find a record from a daughter in the 1930s writing to the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, at the height of the Great Depression, and in which, I'm paraphrasing, she will say, "My mother is dying of cancer. I also have cancer. My father has passed away. My mother was rejected for a widow's pension. You and your husband, the president, have done so much for the world, right, during this, and you've done a lot for Black people." And they did. "Can you please look into this case?" The First Lady responds in 7 days. I can't get people to answer an email in 2 weeks. And the fact that the First Lady will then demand that the government looks into this, like, to me, there was a beauty in that this woman was able to establish a relationship during one of the most well-known historical moments to ask to be remembered and to be valued. And the First Lady responds. Have to read the book to see how it ends, but there's a lot of, to me, beauty in those kind of stories.
Right. There are these absolutely remarkable individual personal stories. Someone that Holly and I have both mentioned, who's in the book, Benjamin Davis, who tried to join the 54th. And, the thing I said to Holly afterwards is, wow, they should make a movie about that, and they really should. And again, it's remarkable. But one of the things that I really appreciated is, in addition to these truly remarkable, kind of exceptional personal stories, there's also a story of, most of us, frankly, are not exceptional, right? Most of us are just kind of bopping through our lives doing things. And the way that these families, these soldiers and these families were taking action in a way that, again, doesn't seem extraordinary, but collectively, for example, in applying for pensions, in demanding to the US government, our families matter, our experience matters, just that idea of collective action that you put, I found fascinating.
Yeah, the thing that I love about using the Civil War pensions, so there are multiple, just in case anyone's curious. So there were invalids or veteran pensions, then there was a widow's pension, there was fathers, usually a mother's, and then a minor's that was only up until the child was 16 that they could document. And the thing, and other scholars, so if you wanted to learn about Black women in North Carolina, Brandy Clay Brimmer, Brimmer, she wrote a book, it's phenomenal, came out in 2020, called Claiming Union Widowhood. She also talks about Black women connected to these to North Carolinian Black soldiers and their collective actions. So the thing for I and a few other scholars acknowledge is, by applying for a pension, especially for women, that they are making explicit citizenship demands. And in a number of instances, when they get awarded it, they are actually being acknowledged as citizens of the United States. Now, this goes beyond this conversation, but for me, I love teaching students about what does the word citizen mean, and let's unpack it, particularly from a historical standpoint, because the thing I like to emphasize to them is how, for example, Black people were always citizens, particularly to their state, especially if we're talking about paying taxes. It was when it came to things like the right to vote that those were not being offered. But the pensions can be looked at and understood as women and families making explicit citizenship demands during times when they were not recognized as citizens in other aspects, that being the right to vote. but Black women's voices in the pensions are there. And to me, what also makes these people phenomenal, they're not Frederick Douglass. They're not Sojourner Truth. They're not Harriet Tubman. They're not William Still or Stephen Swales, right? They're not these big names, the who's who. These are, I hate the word average, but these are average people. They're working class, working poor individuals who collectively come together and are committed to keeping their families safe as much as possible and valued. And to me, that is extraordinary. As I told the descendant this morning, what makes her and people like her family stories inspirational to me is it demonstrates that we can all make changes. And I told her, I said, you know what I love about doing this work is I use your family stories to hopefully inspire students to know that they can do something right now, right? And that they can make a change. And we don't need to wait for others or the famous person to do it. Everyone can do things right now, regardless of your socioeconomic status, gender, location, to make fundamental changes, hopefully for better in the world we live.
If you'd be willing to speak more to that, I know that you have done a lot of work with your students at Furman and before, and just that notion of each of us as a potential historian. I would love to hear you talk about that some more.
Yeah. Where to begin? So part of this, I'll backtrack and I'll do a fast version. So I had a total knee replacement in 2020, youngest person ever in Augusta, Georgia to have that. That was fun. And this was also around when Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and all that was hit. And I got a random message one day from a music artist who apparently had their father worked at Augusta. So we talked and I told the person, look, I'm so tired of people talking about whichever side of the political spectrum, history matters, whatever. I said, how about we do something right now to actually put kids through college and to give them to leave without debt, because that matters. It pains me that college students, and I was this as well, I never want to hear college students say, I can't afford the books, or I can't eat, or I can't find housing. Like, that's not okay. And I say this as someone who was formerly homeless. Like, I don't ever want someone to have to deal with that hardship. It sucks in so many levels. So that led to my efforts and others to raise an endowed scholarship at Augusta University with the explicit purposes of providing students who want to study Black history to be able to have their tuition for the year paid for, and to have we also got 11 students books paid for this semester. And that, to me, like when the students said thank you, I'm a crier. That's just who I am. So when talking with the students, and they're like, one of them was like, he's like, look, I'm not even gonna lie, I didn't use the money for the books, I had to use it for food. And I said, bro, I don't care. Like, did it help you to be able to do what you need to do? He said, yes. I said, then I'm happy, because I'm like, I want you to be able to follow your dreams. At Furman, so I've only been at Furman for about a year, and I'm the first apparently Black professor in the Department of History in Furman, which is weird, but also I've learned I'm the third Black professor ever at Alabama in the history department, the second at Augusta. I'm not a trailblazer, I'm not special, I'm just a mom's son who loves history. But at Furman, what I did was I had a class around roots, Alex Haley miniseries and book. And the end project was students had to record themselves doing oral history and contextualize. I don't want to know your story. I want to know where you come from. So give me 2 or 3 generations back of you or some famous person and contextualize that. And the students killed it. I literally had a student email me this morning. She's graduated and it's like, yo, so I thought you said that this was supposed to be put into the university's archives. What's going on? My family's asking. We want to see it. And to me, there's such excitement because I learned so much from my students. And my goal, hopefully, with their permission, is to have it in the university's archives forever. Because how inspirational, and I asked this to them, would it be for you to come back 5, 10 years from now and sit in a room and know that everyone in here is reading a book or listening to a lecture about your family? And this is nothing I did. You did all the work. You did the recording. You did the research. I had the privilege of reading them. And these were the best projects I've ever seen. And it was the most meaningful project I've ever seen. And I promise you, when these are at the university's library forever, you need to see them. because they talk about the NAACP and one of their connections to it. They talk about civil rights activism. One of them traced their family all the way back to enslavement in Virginia. And she's decided she's going to write a children's book about her family, which I was like, that's not what the class asked for, but I want to read it. And to me, there was just so much joy in learning how every one of us are historical actors and figures who matter. And that your stories, every one of you in this space, I wish you would record your life history, because the dork in me as a historian listens to people talk about themselves. And I'm like, man, I really wish you'd write that down, because I would love to have a class read your experiences, to listen to your stories. So for me, it's about how we can diversify our campus immediately, how we can get our campus and other campuses to look like the communities. I want the histories of Nicholtown in that universe. I want the histories of every possible person in this area to be heard, because I'm so tired of people saying we have to wait for this to happen. No, my students are the agents of change, and I get to ride their coattails.
So fabulous. So for those of us in this event virtual space, are there ways that we can be supportive of your efforts?
First, and I would say is, the more diversity in the student campus, like the culture, like I want to see more diversity. And for me, it's particularly, I'm always surprised how few local students there are that go to Furman for different reasons. And some who are students of color have told me they didn't feel like they would be valued there. I would say, if there's any interest by both organizations and individuals in this or that witness this, if you are interested in telling your histories and having these documented, I would love to start that conversation with our archivists and the special collections to do that. The other thing is, and I realize that this is a lot to ask of people, so I'm always careful about it. If there are those who feel inclined and have the means to do so, to provide opportunities to endow a scholarship or funds, and it doesn't have to be at Furman. I'm gonna keep it real. Like, if you want to do it at another school, that's fine too. I'd like anything to support students' aspirations to improve their opportunities. Creating ways for funds for books, funds for housing, whatever those are so inclined to do. And the other thing, the cheap plug is, if you like my book, support it and know that this book was only possible because of the work and collaboration with my students. And I actually mentioned that in my acknowledgements, because I'm gonna keep it real. Most times when I was working on this book, I would lecture it in class, parts of it, and at the end of the class, this is what I'd ask the students. So class, did that make sense? Or was like, what did you think of that point or this example? And I had a few students at Augusta, especially, be like, that ain't it, chief. Like, no. And I'd be like, so how can I make it clear? And they would give me feedback. And I wanted to make sure that they were acknowledged, because they are so smart. They're inspirational to me. They're so much smarter than I. And I don't say this to make them feel good. I say it because I'm serious. Like, they are so much smarter than I was when I was working on my doctorate for these sophomore and freshmen. And I think the thing is, they just need to be supported, and whatever that means for them, and just know that there is a commitment by them to make the campus more inclusive, and I want to help to make that possible.
Absolutely, absolutely. Touching back on something you were talking about a little bit ago, where you were talking about the women pursuing pensions as sort of a demand related to citizenship, and absolutely, and that being sort of the civic citizenship, what we think of. But there's a phrase that you used in your book,
yes,
cultural citizenship,
yes,
that I really loved. Right, the idea of independent. Why don't take it away?
So there's two phrases. So cultural citizenship, and then infra politics, INFRA politics. It's like one single. I love those terms. So the thing is, like, they haven't been used in a while. And I just randomly went down a rabbit hole and I was reading some of those terms, and I thought to myself, I want to use them. So the thing with cultural citizenship is it's a term many scholars have used to talk about, even if in the context of the United States, even if the United States is denying various forms of citizenship, such as the right to protection of their civil rights, the freedom of movement, because that's one students often never think about. I'm like, you know what we take for granted, myself included, is that I can go to another state and come back in theory, right? As long as I didn't do anything bad. But that's actually protected by like citizenship. That's a part of that. Like you can leave the country in theory, but with cultural citizenship, it's this notion that an individual or individuals can demand or view themselves as belonging to a place, to a nation state, to a country, whatever, even if it's being denied in terms of full citizenship. And if we take that approach, then we actually understand that these people are citizens and they see themselves in a more inclusive way than what the state or federal government at the time or now views of them. And also that term for those students who are, more modern contexts, who are, let's say, undocumented. And so I say, like, this is a term that is still relevant today, right? Like, there are many ways in which, as a person of color, I do not feel valued in this country, especially with everything that's been happening the last couple of years. But I still want to belong to this country. So that's where that notion of cultural citizenship can be very inclusive. And so someone who was enslaved could still make demands and views themselves as belonging to a nation that doesn't even see them as a human being. All women are not seen as full and equal citizens, yet they will view themselves as such. So it's like, to themselves, they're citizens, even if they're being denied these aspects. And so it's a term that is still relevant today. And the other one I love, infrapolitics, is one that once I learned it, I realized I can't unsee it. The simple version for infrapolitics is if the oppressed or the individuals without power seek to reassert power. So an example I use in my classes, in this situation, class, I have the power and I recognize that. And you don't in many instances. But if I say class starts at 6:05 and you shut the class at 6:15, you have reasserted and tried to shift the power dynamics. So if we use infrapolitics, women, people of color, are actually agents of change and they're not victims, and that we need to acknowledge they're always challenging those power structures. So now for me, I always see infrapolitics everywhere, including when my pets don't do what I want them to do, which is all the time.
Yeah, I highly relate to that. My dog is sequestered off with my husband. I do not trust. One of the things that struck me is, I know in general, when people in America think of the civil rights movement, they tend to think of, 20th century. Mm-hmm. And you very much situate what was happening with these soldiers and their families as part of the civil rights movement. I'd love to hear more about that.
So that I want to make sure I give plugs to other scholars where I got that from. So Doctors Hillary Green, she's at Davidson College, Kate Masser, and a few others is people who have started that, and I'm happy to be in their conversation. So the thing I'm always trying to acknowledge is that civil rights activism has a long, rich, diverse history. So in my classes, I try to make sure to acknowledge how even an enslaved person who jumps off of the boat rather than go through the institution of slavery, that's a form of the demonstration of their civil rights activism and trying to reclaim themselves. But in the context of the Civil War era, the way I wanted to frame it was Black women in particular, they're doing sit-ins, right? So we talk, and rightly so, about people like Rosa Parks and others, but sit-ins have a long history that go way before her, including in South Carolina. But you see it often on various forms of public transit when Black people, North, South, East, and West, are going to support the war effort. And Black women will actually take up legal civil suits because they'll say, you are denying access to this public transit when all I'm trying to do is support the war effort and my family. So they will connect their civil rights activism during that period of time to their familial connections and patriotism. So for me, it's like when I teach a class about African American history or American history in general, I want students to understand what makes people like Medgar Evers and others doing this phenomenal work, including one of my former advisors at Iowa. He was actually part of the Freedom Rides, and I'll never forget. He was a white male who was Quaker, and just hearing him talk about witnessing his friends being arrested and one of them murdered. That really hit home for me because it was real for him and he still lived with it. But contextualizing those experiences, which are real, to others who have been doing it, we understand there is a rich legacy to demand equality. So for me, these families in this book, which includes white family members, are part of civil rights activism. So for me, when I'm talking, I usually like, about the 60s, 50s, and even now, I'll say things like modern civil rights, because I want to acknowledge that people were doing it before in different ways that are just as important. And if we ignore them, we're actually doing a disservice to activism that is rich and long.
Right. Wherever there is unfairness, there are people pushing against that.
Exactly.
Absolutely. I'm curious to know, so I am confident you have forgotten more about, Black soldiers and their families in the Civil War than I will ever know. But just in your talking to people who have sort of a sense of, whether it's the Civil War, whether it's, Black soldiers in the Civil War, African-American situation, what do you think are some of the most common misconceptions? Like, what do you think a lot of us are bringing to the table where it's like, oh, yeah, no.
All right, well, I think it depends on the audience, usually. And I think, honestly, a lot of the misconceptions are other academics, to be honest, more than the public. Because, like when I talk to people in public spaces, they're like, yeah, of course. I'm like, oh, I wish you were another academic because you agree with what I'm saying. So I think some misconceptions are there is an erasure of Black women's importance in the Civil War era. For whatever reason, I know. They're devaluing their importance is offensive to me because there is a lot of work about white women's North and South activism. But Black women are usually put to the background as though they just watched everything and did nothing, when that is the farthest from the truth. I think the other thing that is more general is I love Glory, all right? I have watched that movie 1,000 times. I can quote it word for word, which is very embarrassing that I know. But the problem with that film is that, and I understand why, that's how people understand the moment. So they take that as though that's the catch-all. When the thing about Glory, the 54th Massachusetts, that is a misconception is, firstly, people have lost the conversations about their families, that Black women were always in military spaces, that Black families and communities were impacted by their service. But also we've missed opportunities to talk about free-born Black people. When people usually talk about Civil War era Black experience, it's of enslavement. And I'm saying when I get asked to do interviews sometimes, like, hey, can you talk about enslaved people in South Carolina? I'm like, no, I don't do that. Unless you want to talk about Black people who are coming into the Carolinas and are their liberators. And that is actually the case because these Black regiments are in Charleston. They're actually involved in one of the most important events in terms of liberation celebration events that I don't know why it's not discussed. So it's just, I wish there was more emphasis on free-born Black people so we can understand the diversity of the Black experiences, because there is no singular. Even in this, everyone in this space, we all experience moments very differently, and they're all important to recognize, to truly understand them. So I think that's the one of the biggest hurdles, and hopefully this book pushes that conversation, is we need to talk about Black people who are free and their hardships, and their experiences are very different, and they're very unique from those who are enslaved.
Absolutely. In addition to your book, which I hope is obvious to everyone watching this, I think is wonderful and strongly recommend. And yeah, exactly. I hope everybody, use that coupon, get your 30% off. Are there other works, for an audience like ours, where
Yes.
I guess I would describe us as we're interested, but we're not experts,
Oh no, yeah.
Lay people. What would you recommend in addition to yours? What might you recommend us to read?
So I would say Dr. Brandy Clay Brimmer's book, again, is Claiming Union Widowhood. Another book is Dr. James G. Mendez, Mendez. He wrote a book called A Great Sacrifice. That's another excellent book. If you wanted to learn about, I mean, I wish I had all my books behind me. It's so hard. Let's see, some other great ones. Chandra Manning, Manning. Anything she writes, period. Chandra Manning is phenomenal. Dr. Kelly Mezurek, Mezurek, and I'm happy to follow up with some of these names after. She wrote a book about Black families in Ohio. So I think that's also an interesting one, an important one. And then I'll just close with Dr. Barbara Gannon, Gannon. She wrote many books, but one in particular called The One, WON Cause. And what her book talks about is Black people's activism post-Civil War era to have their histories remembered. And she has a number of discussions about the Black women's organizations, which are going to be the ones spearheading the memory and the legacy of these people's stories. So for me, it's like, I like historians, scholars in general, who are understanding of personal and nuanced experiences, not just people in uniform, and this is their only life. That ain't true at all. We need to understand these people as people, not as just historical figures.
Absolutely.
But I would say I'm open if any interested people here or watching would love to follow up with an email. You're more than welcome to email. I'll try my best to answer. I got a baby coming, so we'll see how things go after that.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, we are coming right in on 10 till. And so I wanted to open the floor if people have questions that they've been holding on to, but we're waiting for now to ask. You can.
Yes, please. No question is ask whatever you'd like.
Well, looks like you covered it so thoroughly. Holly, is there anything else? Are there questions you wish we had asked, or any just sort of final thoughts that you want to?
I would say that my hope of all hope is that this conversation, at minimum, will at least lead people to see the value in their historical worth. That every one of you in this call, please take a moment and look through your attic. I say this to everyone, you have records of yourself and the people in your life that deserve to be documented, taught, discussed, valued on the same lens of the people I study. If y'all like this book and want to have a conversation afterwards, I would be honored. I'm at the point where I am so eager and hopeful that there is an audience that wants to have conversations about these and other topics. And then if you like it, please tell others, because the only way and I told my mom this, the only way this book is going to be successful in terms of getting out there is through people like yourselves. Because I can say all day long, my book's great, but yeah, of course I'm going to say that. But if it comes from people like yourself saying, this is a meaningful book, that would mean the world to me. And I'll just close with the relative that I talked to today. She cried so much at the idea that you care, right? So here's what I'll say. If you read the book, Alfred Rothwell, that's the relative I'm talking about. It's her family, Alfred Rothwell's family. And as she was talking, I was like, yeah, I remember everything you're saying about your family. And just know that there are people in that community that are struggling in terms of do they just move on because it's too difficult to remember the hard times? And I told her, if we do that, we're losing sight of how phenomenal your family and people like them were in changing this country in ways that I will always be grateful. So just it would mean, because I told her from this point forward, I will always mention her family as part of my talks, just so she and hopefully knows that there are people committed to having her value, because that hurts me personally when people, they think who am I? I'm a nobody. I mean, I'm a nobody. I like to read and write. That's really it. So just reading this and disseminating this and documenting your own histories are a way to put value to people who don't think they're worthy of being taught and studied. Every one of us is.
Absolutely.
And thank you for your time.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Holly. And question for you, would it be okay to, you had mentioned people getting in touch with you. Would it be okay to put your Furman email address like
Yes.
in the chat to send it to?
Yes.
Okay.
And I'd also, if you Google my name, and I have a personal website, it's like drhollypinheirojr.com. There's a bunch of pieces that I've written. There's a bunch of previous interviews that I've done. So if you want to check out my website as well. But yes, feel free to contact me if you have questions. Honestly, even if the email's like, hey, I really liked, or this one story moved me in this way, I'm telling you, I will call all of my academic friends. I will call my mom and mention that, because like, this is the point where it's like, I used to just call my mom and be like, hey, I read this really like powerful story about this person. And she's like, thanks, baby. That's great. I got to go cook now. Right. And I'm like, Mom, I want to talk about this. Right. So it's like, now to be able to say like, Mom, somebody just emailed me talking about these people. And like, that's the conversations I'm wanting to have now, because I always call my mom. So.
Absolutely. Holly, I see a question that popped up in the chat. If you are familiar with John McFall, whose great niece, Lanife Hollister, just published a book of his memoirs. Does John McFall, does that name ring a bell to you?
That name does not, but that does not mean that others, I will start, that's the historian way of saying I will circle and try to find that. I'll say, so I am working on my second book. It's going to be a while. But it's going to look at all Black Pennsylvanians who served in the United States Colored Troop regiments. And the other part of that book is going to actually also acknowledge Lucretia Mott, because her family will donate the land that becomes Camp William Penn, where these soldiers and communities are training. And for whatever reason, and this is something that always irks me, we have ignored, and I'm saying academics have ignored, how important Lucretia Mott is to American history. Not just for her women's rights activism, which alone makes her important, but that she was one of the most staunch supporters for Black people and Black military service. So much so that she would visit them daily to provide them with support, including food. And as someone who's a light sleeper, I couldn't imagine having a military base behind my house. That's how much she cared. So I'm going to make sure she is one of the central figures in this book. The next
that is wonderful. Also, a light sleeper who's about to have a baby. Bless your heart.
Yeah, life is going to be fun.
Wonderful. Well, Holly, I'm sure on behalf of all of us, I cannot thank you enough for your time with us here this evening, for your work in general, for, I don't know if you saw, the many comments in the chat, thanking you and appreciating this. I also want to extend my thanks to everyone who attended tonight. I just, I know we're all zoomed out and then some, and y'all taking the time to be here, we really appreciate. And again, with a particular shout out to Laura Haight, who made all the technical stuff happen. So on behalf of the Greenville branch, NAACP, and on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Greenville County, I wish y'all all the best of possible evenings and look forward to seeing y'all again soon, whether virtually or in person. Thank you so much.
So much.